The day they read my husband's estate inventory, 14 people laughed. I counted them. Not because counting mattered in that moment, but because counting was what I did when the world turned ugly. I counted to keep still. I counted to keep standing. I counted so my hands would not shake where people could see them. I was 17 years old. I was wearing a borrowed black morning dress that hung past my wrists and bunched at the shoulders because the woman who lent it to me was built for a different life than I was. I stood at the front of the probate room in Harlan County with my chin level and my back straight while the deputy clerk read aloud everything my husband, Thomas Holt, had left behind. A two-room cabin with a cracked stove, 12 acres of rocky ridge above a creek run, a kitchen cellar in need of floor repair, a set of rusted tools, a debt on a mill saw purchased on credit, and no woodpile. That was the part that broke the room open. In the mountains of Virginia, a man without a woodpile in late autumn is a man who has decided to die. The clerk said it with the flat authority of someone reading a weather report. No cordwood visible on the property at time of inspection. And from the back of the room, a man's voice said it loud enough for every soul present to hear. Holt buried his wood same place he buried his sense. 14 mouths opened. 14 sets of teeth caught the lamplight. I watched each face and I memorized each one. Not for revenge, not yet. I memorized them because memory was the only thing I owned that nobody had ever managed to take from me. Mrs. Harriet Gale sat at the head table with her steel gray bun pulled tight against her skull and her iron spectacles balanced on a nose that had spent 40 years looking down at people. She had her hands folded over the inventory like a minister presiding over a burial, which in a way she was. She had known me since I was 7 years old. She had processed my placements when I was awarded to the county, assigned me to homes that did not want me, and watched me come back from each one like a piece of furniture returned for a scratch nobody could buff out. She looked at me over those spectacles and said in a voice built to carry well, "Mrs. Holt, it seems your husband has buried your future right alongside his firewood." More laughter. I did not move. What I did was look at the inventory one more time. The clerk had it tilted toward the table, but I could read upside down. I had been reading upside down since I was 9, a trick I learned at the Pritchard house when the only books were on the far side of the kitchen table and I was not allowed to touch them. The words that caught me were these floor repairs to cellar access. I did not know why those words pulled at something in my chest, but they did. They pulled the way a thread pulls when it is attached to something heavy on the other end, something you cannot see yet but can already feel the weight of. After the reading, as people filed out into the thin October sunlight, Mrs. Gale took my elbow. Not gently, she steered me to the side of the room the way you steer a child away from a mud puddle, as though the mess I was about to make was an inconvenience she could prevent if she moved quickly enough. "There is a family in Millhaven who needs a kitchen girl," she said. "I could write the letter this afternoon. You would have a roof, Clara, a proper roof and meals and work suited to your station." "I am going to the cabin," I said. Her jaw tightened. I had seen that expression before. Every time I had been sent back from a placement, she wore it. The expression of a woman whose filing system has been disrupted. "I have placed you 4 times, she said. 4 families. Not one of them kept you. The Aldrich family said you ate too much. The Pritchards said you would not stop asking questions. The church dormitory said you burned candles after hours reading seed catalogs. The widow Haskins sent you back because you corrected her ledger in front of company." She leaned closer. "What makes you think a dead man's cabin will be any different from every home that already decided you were not worth keeping?" I felt the words land. I will not pretend I did not. Every name she listed was a door that had closed in my face, and each closing had taught me the same lesson. The world wants quiet girls who work without thinking. And I was not quiet, and I could not stop thinking. That was the flaw written into my bones. That was the reason I had been passed from hand to hand like an ill-fitting coat nobody wanted to wear, but nobody could quite throw away. But standing in that probate room, something answered her that came from a place I had not known existed. Those families did not keep me because I noticed things I said. I remembered numbers. I read almanacs and corrected arithmetic and kept measurements in my head. That was my crime in every house you put me in, Mrs. Gale. I was not quiet enough to keep. She stared at me. "I am going to the cabin," I said again. and I turned away from her before she could answer. That was the first time in my life I had walked away from Harriet Gale. It would not be the last. But before I tell you about the cabin, you need to understand one thing. One moment, because without it, nothing that follows makes any sense. I was 16 years old working a farm stand on the edge of Millhaven for a family whose name I have since let go. My job was to weigh grain sacks and collect payment and keep my mouth shut. I was failing at the third part. The farmer's calculations were wrong. He was shorting customers by nearly 2 pounds per sack because he was using a weight table copied from a catalog that had a misprint in the third column. I could see the error from 10 feet away, the way some people see a crooked picture frame from across a room. I was muttering the correct numbers under my breath when a man stopped at the stand. He was lean with dirt under his nails and a stillness about him that made you think he was always listening to something you could not hear. He stood there for a full minute watching me mouth numbers while the farmer weighed sacks in front of customers. "You count the way my father counted," he said, "like the numbers owe you something." I looked up at him. Nobody had ever described what I did in words that sounded like a compliment. Nobody had ever described it as anything other than a problem. His name was Thomas Holt. We were married 3 months later. He was the only person in my life who saw the machinery of my mind and did not ask me to shut it off. For 11 months, I had a home that wanted me. For 11 months, I belonged to someone who thought my noticing was not a flaw, but a gift. Then a fever took him in 6 days, and I was standing in a probate room with $1.13 in my pocket and 14 people laughing at what he had left me. I left 4 days after the reading. Mrs. Gale did not wish me luck. She said nothing at all when I climbed into the back of Emmett Howell's wagon, which was heading east toward the ridges and could drop me within 3 miles of the hollow. My possessions fit inside a single case. One suitcase with a cracked latch, a sewing roll, a tin button box holding 3 pencil stubs, and the $1.13. The road got worse with every mile. The wagon ruts turned to bare rock with mud between, and Emmett stopped talking. The silence was not unkind. It was the silence of a man who knew where I was heading and did not see the point in pretending otherwise. The trees changed as we climbed. Down in Millhaven, the oak still held a few rusted leaves. Up here, everything was stripped. Gray branches against a gray sky and the wind coming through the wagon boards like it had somewhere to be and resented the delay. Emmett let me off where the main track forked. He pointed up a narrow cut between 2 ridges. Half mile, maybe more. Cabin is at the top of the hollow. I thanked him. He looked at me for a long moment. "You got people coming to help," I shook my head. He nodded the way men nod when they hear what they expected. Then he clicked his tongue and the horses moved on. I was standing alone on a mountain road in late November with a suitcase that weighed almost nothing because there was almost nothing in it. The walk took longer than half a mile. The track was overgrown in places and washed out in others. Twice I climbed over fallen timber that nobody had bothered to clear since Thomas died. By the time I saw the cabin, my boots were soaked through and my hands were shaking from cold. That had nothing to do with courage and everything to do with altitude. The place looked exactly like a joke. The chimney leaned slightly south as if it had made peace with the idea of falling. The paling fence was half swallowed by dead broom sedge. The roof shingles were dark and curling at the edges. The yard was frozen into ruts from summer mud that had hardened and no one had smoothed. And beside the cabin, in the space where a woodpile should have stood, there was nothing. Bare ground, frozen weeds, empty air. I stood in the dying light and stared at that empty space, and I did not feel brave. I felt cold. I went inside. The door latch was stiff with rust. I put my shoulder into it, and the door gave with a sound like a bone cracking. The smell that came out was old ash and mouse droppings, and something underneath that was not rot. Something dry. Something waiting. 2 rooms. The front room held a cook stove with a cracked firebox, a table with one leg shimmied with folded newspaper, 2 chairs with split seats, and a bed frame with a straw tick that sagged in the middle. The back room was smaller. Shelves with empty mason jars. A few tools so rusted they looked like they had been pulled from a river. I found 3 matches in a tin on a shelf. I used one to light the stub of candle on the table. The flame was small and yellow, and it made the shadows in the cabin move like living things. My breath came out in clouds. This was my inheritance. This was what they had laughed about. I could not start a fire because there was nothing to burn except the furniture, and I was not desperate enough for that. Not yet. I wrapped myself in 2 blankets from a trunk, sat on the bed with my back against the wall, and reached for one of my pencil stubs. I started an inventory. I wrote on the back of a newspaper page that had been lining the trunk. I wrote down everything I could see in that cabin, everything that was there, and everything that was missing. Stove cracked, but possibly functional. Table stable if shim holds. Candle 2 inches remaining. Matches 2. Firewood none. Food unknown, check cellar. Blankets thin, wool moth damaged. This is what I did when the world was falling apart. I reached for a pencil. I made a list. I measured the size of the disaster so the disaster could not be larger than my understanding of it. I could not sleep. The cold crept up through the floorboards and through the straw tick and through the blankets until it felt like the cabin itself was made of cold, and the walls were just something to hold it in shape. Sometime after midnight, I lit my second match and got out of bed. I was not looking for anything specific. I was looking for anything at all. I walked the cabin slowly, holding the candle low, examining the floor, the walls, the places where boards met and plaster cracked. And that is when I saw it. A section of planks beside the kitchen table, darker than the rest, worn smooth in a pattern that did not match the way feet would naturally walk across a kitchen floor. The wear marks were concentrated in a rectangle, as if something heavy had been dragged repeatedly across the same spot. I knelt down, my knees aching on the cold floor. I held the candle close. The boards were not nailed down. They were fitted into a frame tongue and groove snug enough to look permanent, but designed to be removed. And in the corner of that frame, almost invisible under a layer of soot and years of kitchen grease, there was an iron ring. My fingers were numb. I hooked them through the ring and pulled. The section of floor came up like a trapdoor balanced on hidden hinges, and beneath it was darkness and a smell of damp earth and potatoes going soft. A root cellar. I'd expected a root cellar. What I had not expected was what I found in the back wall of that cellar. I lowered myself down the ladder with the candle and found what I had come for. Withered potatoes in a bin, a few jars of something dark, a barrel of flour turned to chalk, stone walls, packed earth floor, cold. And then I saw it, a door, set into the back wall of the cellar like it had always belonged there and like it had absolutely no business being there at all. Timber framed and iron strapped and latched with a beam so heavy I had to use both hands to lift it. It looked like something built to keep out an army. I stood there for a long time. The candle dripped wax onto the packed earth floor. I listened to the silence of the cellar, which was a different silence than the cabin above. Thicker, deeper, older. Then I lifted the beam and pulled. The door swung open and cold did not rush out. That was the first thing I noticed, and it mattered more than anything that came after. Behind a door buried in the earth in late November, the air should have been freezing. Instead, what met me was cool and steady, not warm, not cold, something between, something stable. And it smelled of oak and dust and a quality I could only describe as patience. The smell of something that has been waiting a long time and is not in a hurry. I held up the candle. The light caught wood, split oak, pale and clean, stacked in rows that ran back into a darkness my candle could not reach. I took one step forward, then another. The passage was lined with stone. The ceiling was shored with timber. The floor was packed earth with a slight downward slope, just enough to carry water away from the wood if water ever reached this far. I understood instantly it would not. This passage had been built to keep water out the way a ship is built to keep water in. Every surface was angled. Every joint was sealed. Every stone was fitted. I counted my steps. 10, 20, 30. At 40, I looked back and the cellar opening was a small square of lesser darkness behind me. At 50 steps, I found the end. 30 cords, maybe more. Stacked to within a foot of the ceiling, sorted by size, separated into bays with charcoal marks on the stone walls. All of it dry, all of it split clean, all of it waiting for someone to come and find it. I picked up 2 pieces and struck them together. They rang a clear, hard sound. The sound of wood seasoned for years in air that never changed, that never froze, that never thawed, that simply held. I put both hands flat on the nearest stack and pressed. I needed to know it was real. I needed the texture of it, the rough grain against my palms, the weight and solidity of a thing that was not a dream and not a cruel joke and not another door closing in my face. My shoulders shook once. I breathed. I pressed harder. Then I picked up 2 splits of oak, carried them up the ladder, and built the first fire the cabin had seen since Thomas died. The stove drew badly because of the cracked firebox, but the wood caught fast and burned hot, and within an hour the cabin had gone from a tomb to something that felt, if not like a home, then at least like a place where a person could survive long enough to think. I sat beside that fire and I watched the flames until dawn. I did not try to name what I felt. I did not need to. The fire was enough. In the morning, with daylight coming pale through the frosted windows, I went back down. The tunnel was still there. It had not been a dream. At the mouth of the passage, resting on a stone shelf I had missed in the candlelight, there was a carpenter's chest. I dragged it into the cellar where the light from the open trap door was stronger, and I opened it. Journals. 13 of them. 9 were pocket field books, small enough to fit in a coat bound in oilcloth, the paper soft with age, the handwriting cramped and slanted to the right. These were old. They belonged to Elias Holt Thomas's father. I had never met Elias. He died before I came to the Hollow. 4 were ledger books, larger, the pages still crisp, the handwriting careful and precise and familiar. These were Thomas's. I recognized his hand the way you recognize a voice in a crowd. The slight upward slant of his letters, the way he crossed his sevens, the blue-black ink he mixed himself from oak gall and iron. I started with Elias. His first entries were from 22 years before, and they were not about wood at all. They were about loss. He had counted everything the mountain had taken from him, the way I counted faces in a probate room. A shed collapsed by ice in the winter of 1874. A wagon robbed at the creek crossing that spring. A full winter's fuel supply ruined when sleet glazed his woodpile and then froze solid for 6 straight weeks, sealing the splits in a tomb of ice he could not break with a maul or an axe or anything short of a bonfire, which would have destroyed the wood he was trying to save. He wrote down weights and dates and temperatures. He wrote down the names of neighbors who stole from his uncovered stacks when his back was turned. He wrote down how many times he had burned green wood because the dry wood was locked under ice, and how the green wood smoked and popped and gave half the heat for twice the effort. Then on a page dated March of 1876, he wrote this: "Winter only steals what you leave where winter can reach it." I read that line 3 times, then I turned the page. Elias had started digging in the spring of that year. A test hole at first straight back into the hillside behind the cabin, where the slope was steep enough to shed water naturally. He measured temperatures at different depths and found that below a certain point the earth held steady, neither freezing in winter nor warming in summer. He measured moisture levels and found that stone-lined passages with proper drainage stayed dry year-round. He built vent shafts to the surface, disguised to look like old groundhog holes, designed to draw air through the passage without letting rain in, creating a slow, steady current that pulled dampness away from the stored wood, the way a chimney pulls smoke from a fire. The earth itself became a vault, temperature constant, humidity controlled, invisible from the surface, safe from ice, from theft, from every weapon winter used against the men who lived on these ridges. His conclusion, written in a shaking hand years later: "The earth keeps what the air takes. Dry wood below the frost line stays dry. The temperature holds. The thieves cannot see what they cannot find." Thomas had taken his father's discovery and turned it into precision. His ledger books made my chest hurt with their care. Every foot of the tunnel mapped, every angle of the drainage measured, every vent shaft recorded for width and draw rate, every bay numbered and dated, burn rates calculated for mild winters and hard winters and catastrophic winters. Reserve margins figured to the cord. The work of a man who understood that preparation is not pessimism. It is love made practical. And then I found the entry that stopped my breath. It was dated 6 months before Thomas died. The handwriting was the same careful blue-black, but something about the pressure of the pen was different. Heavier, as if he had been pressing hard enough to feel the table through the paper. "If I die before winter, Clara must lift the rear plank by the table leg. The ring is there. She will find the rest." He had known. He had known he might not survive. and he had written my name into his plans the way an engineer writes a load-bearing wall into a blueprint. Not as an afterthought, as a foundation. I sat with that journal open in my lap for a long time. The fire in the stove ticked and settled. Outside, the frozen yard held its silence. He had seen me. Not just the girl who counted and noticed and would not stop thinking. He had seen me surviving alone in this cabin, and he had left me instructions written in the same careful hand he used for everything he built, because in his mind, I was something he had built too. Something worth designing for. Something worth protecting. My jaw was tight enough to ache. I closed the journal. I set it on the table. I put on my coat and walked 3 miles down the mountain to buy lamp oil from Edgar Poole. Poole's general store smelled of tobacco and kerosene and the particular sourness of a man who has spent 30 years weighing other people's misfortune against his own comfort. Edgar Poole stood behind his counter with his arms crossed and his chin tucked and looked at me the way a dog looks at a cat that has wandered into the wrong yard. "Holt's widow," he said. Still out at the hollow, still there. He weighed the oil with the slowness of a man performing a favor. "Your man was a strange one, spent all his time digging in the dirt instead of doing honest work. You planning to keep that up?" "I am planning to survive the winter," he laughed. A short, hard sound with no warmth in it. "With what?" "You cannot heat a mountain with a hole, girl. Your man was a fool and you will freeze proving him company." "I need a pound of flour as well," I said. "On credit." He stopped laughing. "Credit." He said the word like it tasted bad. "On what?" "On what I have. 30 cords of seasoned oak in a dry vault under my cabin. I will pay you double by spring." Poole leaned across the counter. "Your man was a fool," he said again, slower this time, as if I had failed to understand him the first time. "And the county does not extend credit to the dead or the soon-to-be dead." I paid for the oil. I left the flour on the shelf. I walked back out into the cold. The walk back was 3 miles uphill in the dark. The cold had deepened since sundown, and the stars were hard and close, the way they get when the air has no moisture left to soften them. I stopped once at the place where the track curved, and you could look down and see the lights of Millhaven spread along the valley floor. Small lights, lamp oil and candle flame. Ordinary people in ordinary houses with ordinary wood piles stacked where anyone could see them. I turned my back on those lights and walked faster. My boots crunched on the frozen mud. My breath made clouds that disappeared behind me. I was carrying a quart of lamp oil and 87 cents, and the knowledge that beneath my kitchen floor was more seasoned firewood than any home in that valley could claim. Edgar Poole would eat those words. Every one of them. All 14 of those laughing faces in the probate room would see exactly what Thomas Holt had built and exactly what kind of fool his widow was. I just had to live long enough to prove it. The first winter did not try to kill me with cold. It tried to kill me with hunger. February 19th. The cornmeal is gone. Clara knows the date because she has been tracking it on the wall beside the stove, scratching each day with a nail. She checks the snares at dawn and finds them empty and comes back to the cabin shaking so hard she can barely lift the cellar hatch. She builds up the fire, wraps herself in both blankets, sits on the floor with her back against the stove stones, and thinks about quitting. Not dying. Quitting. There is a difference. Dying is what happens to you. Quitting is what you choose. She sits there in the cold that is seeping back through the floorboards, and she considers choosing it. Walking down the mountain to any farmhouse that will take her. A servant's position. A kitchen girl scrubbing floors for a family whose name she will try to forget. Even Mrs. Gale's dormitory with its thin soup and locked candles. At least they feed you there. At least your ribs do not show through your skin when you pull on your coat in the morning. The tunnel has more wood than she can burn in a decade. But you cannot eat oak. She had set the snares the way the pamphlet described. The pamphlet she had memorized 3 years earlier while scrubbing the Pritchard kitchen floor, moving her eyes across the page each time she crawled past the table where it lay open, intended for the Pritchard boys and not for her. She had remembered the diagrams. She had remembered the knot specifications. She had set every snare in open meadow ground exactly as instructed, and every morning for 2 weeks the loops had hung slack and undisturbed. By the 3rd week, she found tracks suggesting something faster than her was taking the catches first. By February 19th, there was nothing left to take. She opens Thomas's journal, not to the tunnel maps, to the last page, to the section she had skimmed in her first reading because it had seemed less important than the tunnel itself, less urgent than the question of surviving the cold. She reads past the foraging plant list. She reads past the line he wrote for her. She reads into the section beneath it that she had not finished. Thomas had recorded a second set of notes. Not about plants, about traps. In heavy snow, he wrote, "Rabbits abandon open ground and move low, following rock overhangs and fallen timber, where the snow is compressed and the footing is solid. Set your snares at the base of south-facing rock shelves no more than 18 inches off the ground. The runs are there even when tracks are not visible." Clara sits with that page open in her lap and feels something move through her that is not relief and is not anger and is not grief. It is the feeling of a student who realizes the teacher knew exactly which mistake she would make and left the correction in the one place she would only find it after she was desperate enough to read past what she thought she already knew. He had not written that note for future readers. He had not written it for the agricultural record. He had written it for her, for the girl who followed instructions precisely and would need to learn that precision and correctness are not always the same thing. She reset the snares before the light failed that afternoon. 6 of them, everyone placed at the base of a rock overhang on the south side of the ridge behind the cabin. Her hands were so weak she had to hold one end of the cord with her teeth while her fingers worked the knot. By the following afternoon, 3 rabbits hung from her belt. She stood in the snow with those rabbits and did not sit down and did not stop. She carried them back to the cabin and she ate the first real meal she had eaten in 11 days. She boiled the bones for broth. She scraped the hides and set them on a rack near the stove. She did not yet know what she would need them for. She only knew she would need them for something. Spring came slow and grudging, the way it does in the mountains, not arriving so much as the cold, making a series of small surrenders. By April, she could see the hillside behind the cabin clearly for the first time since November. That was when she found the vent shafts, 2 of them hidden in a tangle of brush about 40 feet uphill from where the tunnel ran beneath the surface. She had walked past that brush 100 times without a second glance. But now, with the dead growth pulled back by wind and the light hitting the hillside at a low morning angle, she saw stone, fitted stone forming shafts that dropped straight down into the earth. One shaft was open. She could feel air moving when she held her hand over it, a faint, steady pull, like the earth breathing in. The other was block solid, packed with roots and washed in dirt and years of accumulated debris. She went down to the tunnel that afternoon and pressed her palm against the wall of the farthest bay. Slightly damp, just enough to feel the difference. She understood what that meant and what needed to happen. She got the shovel from the shed and started digging. The first 10 feet came out soft enough, dirt and tangled roots and stones that broke loose when she pried at them. But below that, she hit hard pan. Compacted clay mixed with gravel packed so tight that each stroke of the shovel barely chipped the surface. She measured her progress each evening by dropping a stick into the shaft and marking the depth with a notch. 14 feet, 16, 18. Her shoulders burned in a way that went beyond muscle and reached into the joints and stayed there through the night. Her hands, which had finally healed from the winter, split open along the old cracks and calloused over and split again until her palms looked like something belonging to a woman 3 times her age. At 21 feet, the shovel struck fitted stone, a ring of it forming a collar that marked the original shaft opening. Someone had built this long before her. Elias had sunk this shaft decades ago, and Thomas had maintained it, and now she was finishing what they had started. She cleared the last of the debris with her bare hands because the shovel was too crude for the work. Packed leaves and mud and the small bones of animals that had crawled in and never crawled out. She pulled it all free, handful by handful, until the shaft opened and she felt air move against her face. Not a gust, a slow, steady pull. She climbed out, went straight down to the tunnel, walked to the farthest bay, and pressed her hand to the top split of wood. Dry. She walked back to the tunnel mouth and raised her hand near the entrance. She could feel it now. A current. Gentle but constant, moving from the lower intake through the full length of the passage and up through the shaft she had just reopened. She pressed her forehead to the stone wall and stood there, breathing in the smell of clean earth and dry oak until her legs stopped shaking. Then she straightened up, walked back into the daylight, picked up the shovel, and started clearing drainage around the shaft opening. There was always the next thing. 3 days later, she heard footsteps on the kitchen floor above her. She grabbed the shovel, not the lamp, the shovel. She came up the cellar ladder, holding it like a weapon, ready to use it, and found a man standing in her kitchen. He was old, 72 at least, with a face that had been weathered down to its essential structure, all bone and crease and sharp angles. His hands trembled on a cane he clearly resented needing. He wore a canvas coat too thin for Mountain Spring and boots that had been resoled so many times the originals were nothing but memory. He was looking at the open trap door with an expression she could not read. Then he looked at her, at the shovel in her hands, at the dirt on her face and the calluses on her palms and the set of her jaw. "Who taught you to dig for weather?" he asked. "Nobody taught me anything," she said. "I taught myself." He almost smiled. "I saw the spoil pile on the hillside. Fresh dirt. Someone has been clearing the vent line." His eyes were sharp despite his age, the kind of eyes that had spent a lifetime measuring things and were not about to stop. "I helped Elias Holt set those first stones 30 years ago, before you were born, before your husband was grown." He looked at the trap door again. "May I see it?" he asked. His name was Samuel Briggs. He had been a stonemason and a road crew foreman before his lungs started failing him. He had known Elias Holt when they were both young men, had helped build the first retaining wall by the spring ahead back, when the tunnel was nothing but a test hole in an old man's theory. Then he had stopped coming because Elias could not pay him, and because Samuel's son was dying on another mountain, and there are some things that end a man's capacity for anything else. They sat in the cabin that first evening with cups of weak tea and the fire popping in the stove. Samuel held his cup with both hands to hide the tremor in his fingers. It did not work, but Clara pretended it did. And he pretended she was pretending, and that was enough. "I buried my boy before I buried my pride," he said. His voice was rough, not with emotion, but with use the voice of a man who had spent decades shouting measurements across stone quarries. The first was easier. He reached into his coat pocket and took out a piece of pale limestone, smooth from years of handling, small enough to fit in a palm. He turned it in his fingers. Clara watched him and knew without being told that the stone mattered. She did not ask. He would tell her when he was ready, which turned out to be 3 weeks later, sitting on the hillside after a full day of work. "This came from Cinder Ridge," he said, "where my son died. I picked it up the day we buried him." He ran his thumb along the grain. "Some men carry photographs. I carry this." He came back the next morning and the day after. He taught her stonework the way you teach someone a language, one word at a time, repeated until it became reflex. "Feel the grain," he said, pressing her hand flat against a slab of limestone they had pulled from the creek bed. "Stone has directions, same as wood. Cut against it and it shatters. Work with it and it splits clean." He showed her how to read soil. He showed her how to set a dry stack wall with no mortar, every stone carrying the one above it, the angles locking the whole structure together without a drop of anything to bind it. His hands shook when they were idle. When they held stone, the shaking stopped. His hands remembered what his body was beginning to forget. On the 14th day, they argued. Clara wanted to extend the annex using a modified bracing pattern she had found in Thomas's ledgers. Samuel dismissed it without looking at the diagram. 40 years of stonework, he said. "Your husband drew pictures in a notebook." "That is not the same thing." Clara did not back down. She drew Thomas's diagram in the dirt with a stick and showed him the angle calculations and the load distribution and the way the bracing redirected pressure into the hillside instead of onto the floor. Samuel stood over the drawing for a long time. His jaw worked the way it did when he was reconsidering something he had already decided. "Show me that angle again," he said. They compromised. His experience, Thomas's engineering. Months later, working side by side in silence, Samuel looked at the wall they had built together and said without turning his head, "Your husband was smarter than I gave him credit for." And Clara said most people were. He was quiet after that, but it was a different kind of quiet than before. June brought Maggie Lane to her gate. She was 14, thin in the way that tells you thinness is not a choice, with eyes that moved across the cabin and the yard and the spoil pile on the hillside with the quick, systematic attention of someone cataloging everything in case she needed to remember it later. She held a bundle of mending in her arms and stood at the gate without opening it, waiting to be invited, rather than assuming she was welcome. She had been sent from the Dunlap family 2 hollows over to deliver the mending. She was supposed to hand it over and leave. Instead, She saw the cleared vent shaft on the hillside and asked what it was, then asked how deep it went, then asked what happened to the air that entered it. Each question was sharper than the last, the kind of questions that get placement girls sent back to the county. Clara answered every one. Not from generosity, because she was looking into eyes she recognized. The same watchful hunger she had carried at 14 in every house that received her like an inconvenience and waited for her to become invisible. Within a week, Mrs. Dunlap was at the gate. A broad woman with a face set in permanent disapproval, arms crossed, voice pitched for a lecture. "You are filling that girl's head with nonsense," she said. "She has work to do. She is not here to play at whatever it is you are doing up in this hollow." "I am teaching her to read soil and set stone," Clara said. "She is better at it than most grown men I have met. She is supposed to work," Mrs. Dunlap said, "not think." Clara let those words settle in the air between them. She had heard them before. Every family she had ever been placed with had said some version of them. Work, not think. Obey, not question. Be useful in the way we define useful and leave your mind at the door. "Thinking is how I survived the winter," Clara said. "If you want that girl to survive hers, let her think." Mrs. Dunlap's face went dark. "I will report you to the county." "Go ahead," Clara said. "Tell Mrs. Harriet Gale that the Holt widow is teaching a girl to read soil and set stone. See if she laughs this time." Mrs. Dunlap left. Maggie was forbidden from visiting. She came anyway. She learned alongside Samuel, and Samuel, who had lost a child and found no replacement for that loss, taught her with a patience Clara had not seen in him before. He let her hold the limestone piece once. She turned it in her fingers the same way he did, and something in his face shifted that Clara could not name and he would not explain. It was not happiness. It was something quieter and more durable than happiness. Summer brought Jack Doyle to the hollow. He was 23, a timber hauler, with an easy grin and strong arms and the kind of practical confidence that comes from doing physical work in a place where physical work is the only currency that matters. He offered to help haul wood to market. He had a mule and a proper cart, and he said he admired what she was building. The word he used was admired. She believed him because she wanted to. That was her mistake, not trusting him, wanting to trust him. There is a difference, and she knew it even then and chose to ignore it because Samuel was 72 and fading, and Maggie was 14 and learning, and Jack was young and strong and present, and the loneliness of the hollow had been pressing against her ribs for months, like a hand pushing from inside. When he asked questions about the tunnel, she answered them. How deep? How long? How many cords? How the air moved through the shafts and kept the wood dry? How the bays were organized? She told him everything because he listened the way Thomas had listened, head slightly tilted, eyes steady, full attention, given without condition. She confused listening with loyalty. She had made that mistake once before at 16, standing at a grain scale, and that time it had ended in 11 months of belonging somewhere. This time it would end differently. 2 market runs. Jack charmed customers in Millhaven and handled the mule and stood beside her while she negotiated prices, and the work felt less like survival and more like partnership. She began to rely on him. That was the thing she had promised herself she would never do again, and she did it anyway because promises made in strength are easy, and promises kept in loneliness are another matter entirely. Vernon Kraft arrived on a Thursday in late August, riding the same black horse he rode to every property in Harlan County where he held paper on someone's debt. He sat in the saddle at the edge of the hollow, and he recited the dimensions of the tunnel from memory, the number of bays, the total cord capacity, the location of both vent shafts on the hillside above the cabin. He recited all of it with the calm authority of a man reading from a deed, which was exactly what he intended it to feel like. Clara listened to every word. Then she looked past the horse. Jack Doyle stood 10 feet back, not quite behind Vernon and not quite beside him, in the exact position of a man who has done something he cannot undo and has not yet decided how to hold his body in the aftermath. He would not look at her. She stared at him until he had no choice. "I hope what he paid you was worth what you sold," she said. Jack flinched. His mouth opened, closed. He looked at the frozen ground between his boots. Vernon leaned forward in the saddle. He was a large man who had learned early that size and stillness together communicate more than volume. "Thomas Holt owed me for a mill saw purchased on credit," he said. "That debt passed to you when he died. You are 3 payments behind. Miss one more and everything below your kitchen floor belongs to me. The payment is not due until the 1st of April, Clara said. Then you will have it by the 1st of April. She said it without flinching and without looking away from him, which she could see surprised him because men like Vernon Kraft are accustomed to watching people shrink when they speak about money and ownership and the specific power that comes from holding paper on someone's future. He studied her the way he studied land before making an offer, calculating not value but leverage, measuring how much pressure a thing could absorb before it gave way. I could make this easier, he said. Sell me the land. I will forgive the debt and give you enough to start over somewhere that does not fight you at every turn. No, the land is worth nothing, rock and wind and a hole in the ground. Whatever your husband thought he was building it will not save you when a real winter comes. You will have your payment April 1st, Mr. Kraft, and when a real winter comes, you will see exactly what my husband was building. He stared at her for a long moment. Then he turned the horse and rode back down the hollow, and Jack Doyle followed after him like a man walking towards something he deserved and knew it. That evening, Clara went down to the tunnel and changed the beam latch on the cellar door. She added a heavy iron padlock she had taken from the shed. She came back up and laid the rug flat over the trap door and stood on it and looked at the kitchen floor and saw nothing out of the ordinary, which was exactly what she needed anyone else to see. When Maggie came the next morning and noticed the changes, she asked why. Clara said, because the only people I have ever trusted either died or sold me. Maggie was 14 years old and she heard that sentence and said nothing. She already understood what it meant. That was the thing about Maggie that made Clara's chest ache. She was already old enough to understand things that no 14-year-old should have to understand. The hardening happened slowly after that. Clara made the April payment by walking into Vernon Kraft's office in Millhaven with the coins counted to the penny, placing them on his desk without a word, and walking out. She sold wood twice a week through the spring. Eleanor Graves, the school teacher, was her steadiest customer, a woman who paid fairly and asked no questions and sent neighbors who did the same. A woman named Grace Kraft sent her housemaid to market with coins and a purse stamped with the Kraft family crest. Clara noticed the crest, said nothing, but stored that knowledge the way she stored seasoned oak in a dry place where it would keep. Professor Alderman came to the tunnel in May. He was a science teacher at the district academy and a volunteer weather observer for the state, and he had heard the stories. He spent an hour underground with a thermometer and a measuring tape and came back up with an expression on his face that Clara had not seen directed at anything connected with the Holt name before. This is not superstition, he said. This is science. Your husband and his father understood principles that most engineers have not considered. He offered to sketch improved designs for the vent caps and write a circular for the county agricultural office. People should know about this, he said. It could save lives. But people did not want to know. The town still whispered about the crazy Holts and the widow who lived alone in a hole in the ground, and the whispers had a new flavor now. Not just mockery, resentment. She was selling something they could not explain, and what people cannot explain, they would rather dismiss than investigate. Samuel declined through the summer the way a stone wall declines under frost, so slowly you do not see it until the section gives way. Some mornings he could not grip his tools. Some evenings the cough took him for long minutes, and when he lowered his handkerchief, Clara looked away. He still came every day. He still brought his tool bag and his cane and the limestone from Cinder Ridge in his coat pocket. One evening on the hillside, with the ridges turning the color of a bruise in the dust light, he said something she would carry for the rest of her life. Some people look at a problem and see why it will not work, he said. You look at a problem and see what it would take to make it work. That is rare, girl, rarer than you know. She held those words. She held them the way he held his limestone, close, and often, and without needing to explain why. By September, the tunnel held 42 cords, 28 fully seasoned, both shafts open and drawing, the annex complete. On paper, she was more prepared for winter than any homestead in the valley below her. The autumn of 1898 was the warmest anyone could remember. October felt like August. November came in gentle with rain instead of snow and temperatures that let people walk to church in light coats. The wells ran full and the wood piles cured in the open air, and people said it was a blessing. They relaxed. They stopped worrying. They stood in the warm November sunlight and felt like they had been given something extra, a gift of time, a season extended beyond its natural boundary. Clara did not relax. She had found something in Elias's oldest notebook that nobody else had read. He had kept weather records for 22 years, not just temperatures and snowfall, but patterns, sequences, the relationship between one year's conditions and the next. And buried in those records, marked with a double underline he used for nothing else in all 22 years of entries, was a single pattern. The warmest autumns preceded the worst winters. Every time, without exception. She checked his data against her own observations from the 2 years she had been on the ridge. The pattern held. She walked the tunnel one last time before the weather turned. 42 cords, every bay numbered. Every bay, every piece dry and waiting. She ran her hand along the stone wall that Samuel and she had built together during that first summer. The cool, steady air moved against her skin, and she knew what was coming the way a farmer knows what is coming. When the barometric pressure drops and the birds go silent, not from reading the signs, but from being part of the same system the signs belong to. She thought about the 14 faces in the probate room. She thought about Edgar Poole behind his counter. She thought about Vernon Kraft on his black horse reciting the dimensions of the tunnel she had built, while Jack Doyle stood behind him, unable to meet her eyes. She thought about Mrs. Dunlap at the gate telling her to stop filling a girl's head with foolishness. She could warn them. She could walk down to Millhaven and show them Elias's records and tell them what a warm autumn has always meant on these ridges and give them time to prepare. She stood in the kitchen above the sealed trap door, and she made her decision. She locked the tunnel, covered the trap door with a rug, went to bed in a cabin warmed by wood that no winter could reach, and she slept without difficulty. And she did not think about what was going to happen to the people in the valley below her. That was the coldest thing she ever did, and she did it with a clear conscience. It did not come as snow first. It came as rain that turned to glass. Freezing rain fell for 6 hours on the night of January 23rd, coating every surface in a shell of ice so clear and hard that the morning sun turned the whole valley into a hall of mirrors. Fence posts became crystal columns. Tree branches sagged under weight they were never designed to carry. The sound was something Clara had never heard before. A constant low cracking, like the mountain itself was grinding its teeth, the sound of a world being unmade and reset into something colder and harder than what it had been the day before. Then the snow came. 3 days of it, heavy and wet, piling onto the ice layer until the weight brought down limbs and then whole trees. She heard them falling through the night, deep percussive impacts that rolled up the hollow and shook the cabin walls. When it stopped, the drifts were chest high in the lower ground and shoulder high on the ridges. The world outside had become a white country with no roads, no fences, no paths visible. Everything human had been erased. Then the temperature fell. It dropped so fast that the snow compacted and hardened into something closer to concrete than ice. She broke the crust on her well pump with a hammer at dawn, and by noon it had frozen solid again. She stuffed rags into the window cracks, and still the frost grew on the inside of the glass, thick enough to block the view. She navigated the cellar ladder in the dark because the candle blew out in the draft from the trap door, and she would not waste a match relighting it. Her hands knew every rung. Her feet found the packed earth floor without hesitation. She loaded her arms with oak from the fourth bay and carried it up to the stove, and the wood caught on the first match and burned the way properly, seasoned wood burns clean and steady and completely. She was warm, and she knew with a certainty that sat in her stomach like a stone she had swallowed and could not digest that other people were not. For 3 days she did nothing about it. On the fourth day, a child appeared at the edge of the hollow, red-faced and gasping with a scarf wrapped so many times around his face that only his eyes showed above it. He held out a piece of bark and waited for her to take it, and then turned and left without a word, already leaning into the wind before he reached the tree line. The message was scratched in charcoal in a hand she recognized. Careful and precise, each letter formed with the deliberate attention of someone who had been taught that marks on stone must be exact because stone does not forgive imprecision. Maggie's hand, the hand Samuel had shaped. It said 4 words. They will not let me leave. We are out of wood. Clara held that piece of bark and read it twice and set it on the table beside Thomas's journal. Then she sat down, And for the first time since the cold began, she allowed herself to look without flinching at what she had become. She had chosen to let this happen. Not the storm, she could not control the storm. But she had seen it coming in the pages of a dead man's notebook, had read the pattern as clearly as she read anything, and she had decided with full knowledge, in a steady hand, to say nothing, to lock the door, to cover the trap, to sleep soundly while Elias's prediction came true, mile by frozen mile across the valley below her. She had told herself she owed them nothing, and that was true. She did not owe Edgar Poole, who had called Thomas a fool to her face. She did not owe the man in the probate room who had made the joke about buried wood. She did not owe Vernon Kraft, who had sent Jack Doyle into her trust and then arrived on horseback to collect what Jack had sold him. She did not owe Mrs. Dunlap, who had stood at her gate and told her that a girl's thinking was a problem to be corrected rather than a capacity to be used. Every wound on that list was real. None of them had healed. The scar tissue she had built over each one was the only armor she owned, and she had worn it deliberately and without apology through every cold morning and empty snare and lonely evening the Hollow had given her. But Maggie was in that house. Maggie, who had stood at the gate asking questions sharp enough to get a placement girl sent back to the county. Maggie, who had learned to read soil and set stone and had held the limestone from Cinder Ridge in her fingers with the careful reverence of someone who understood without being told that certain objects carry more than their own weight. Maggie, who reminded Clara of herself in ways that made her chest ache, not with nostalgia, but with recognition, the specific recognition of seeing a future narrowing in real time, and knowing you have the power to stop it and having not yet decided whether you will. And the Harbin baby had spiked a fever in a cabin where the water in the bedside pitcher had frozen solid overnight, and old Mrs. Patterson had been found in her chair 2 days after she died. Wrapped in every blanket she owned, the ashes in her fireplace. Long cold, the distance between her door and her nearest neighbor's door, 1,500 feet of snow, that might as well have been 1,500 miles. Clara opened Thomas's journal to the page where he had calculated reserves. He had planned for one person, many winters, a lifetime of fuel for a single careful woman on a ridge that nobody visited. He had not imagined this. He had not sat at his table with his blue-black ink and his precise hand and imagined his widow doing arithmetic about how many families she could carry through a catastrophe she had seen coming and chosen not to announce. She picked up a pencil stub. She did not make an inventory this time. She wrote names. Every family she knew was in trouble, a number beside each name her best estimate of how much wood each household would need to reach the thaw. She added the column twice to be certain. 31 cords. That left 11 for herself. Enough to finish the winter if the coal broke on schedule. Not enough if it did not. She looked at the list for a long time. Then she understood something she had been working not to understand since the day she first read Elias's oldest notebook. Elias had not built a tunnel only for himself. He had written to the county asking for someone to learn his methods, someone to carry the knowledge forward into the next generation and the one after that. Thomas had written her name into his plans not only to save her, but because he believed she was the kind of person who would know what to do with what he left her. Not just survive it, know what to do with it. She crossed out the priority order she had written beside each name. She wrote a single instruction at the top of the page. Whoever comes first, no conditions. Her hand was not steady when she wrote it. That was all right. It did not need to be steady. It only needed to be done. The next morning, she walked out to the edge of the hollow before first light and spent 4 hours clearing a path through the snow to the main track. The drifts were shoulder height in places, and she moved through them with a shovel and with her body packing the snow to the sides, creating a channel barely wide enough for a sled but visible, open, unmistakable from the road below, as an invitation. By the time she finished, her arms were burning past the point where burning is a useful signal, and her back had locked into a single sustained complaint she would carry for 3 days. She went back to the cabin, opened the cellar hatch, moved the rug aside, and sat down at the table to wait. Ada Kraft came first. She was Vernon's sister-in-law, a woman Clara had seen in church on the Sundays she made the walk down to Millhaven, a woman who had said to her once on the church steps that misfortune settles where it is fed, and that Clara should not linger in places where decent families gathered. She arrived at the gate carrying 2 empty buckets. her scarf white with frost, her lips cracked and bleeding at the corners, her eyes red from smoke or weeping, or some combination of the two that cold and desperation tend to produce in people who have exhausted their other options. She could not look at Clara when she spoke. The words came out in fragments. I heard you have wood. We have burned everything. The children are. She stopped, swallowed. The muscles in her throat worked. She tried again and could not finish the sentence. Come inside, Clara said. Warm up while I get you a load. She did not make Ada finish the sentence. She did not make her explain or account for what she had said on the church steps or demonstrate sufficient remorse for the specific shape of her previous unkindness. She opened the cellar hatch and took Ada down the ladder and through the door and into the tunnel, and she watched Ada's face move through something she would not attempt to describe because she did not have the right words for watching a person understand in a single moment that they have been wrong about everything. Wrong about a family, wrong about a dead man, wrong about the woman standing beside them holding a lamp in the place that dead man built. Take from bay 7, Clara said. It catches quickest. Ada filled her buckets. She pressed coins into Clara's hand afterward, her fingers shaking with cold and with something beyond cold. Clara shook her head and closed Ada's fingers back over the coins. Ada opened her mouth and Clara looked at her steadily, and Ada closed it again and left with her buckets and her coins and whatever she was going to carry from that tunnel for the rest of her life. The next day, Ada returned with her neighbor. The day after that, 6 families came. By the end of the first week, a path had been beaten into the snow from the main road to Clara's cabin door, packed solid by sled runners and boot soles, and the accumulated weight of people in motion toward the thing they needed to survive. Samuel sat at the kitchen window with a ledger open on his knee, counting every load that went out and every family that came in. Maggie was not there yet, but Samuel kept a column for her anyway, the way you keep a place at a table for someone you expect. On the 4th day of the giving, a father loaded splits of oak into his sled, while his wife stood at the tunnel entrance, holding their youngest child on her hip. The child reached both arms toward the stacked wood with an expression of pure, uncomplicated wonder, as if the wood were alive, which in every way that mattered it was. Clara watched through the frosted window and felt something settle in her chest that was not forgiveness and was not satisfaction and was not triumph. It was simpler than any of those things and more durable. Samuel looked up from his ledger. They do not deserve this, he said. Maybe not. You could charge them. Wood like this in a freeze like this is worth more than most of them earn in a season. I know what cold does to pride, Clara said. Take the wood. Samuel was quiet for a long time. Then he set down his pen and picked up the limestone from Cinder Ridge and placed it on the windowsill where the thin winter light could reach it. He looked at it for a moment. Then he went back to his counting. On the 5th day, Clara loaded a sled herself and hauled it 2 hollows over to the Dunlap cabin. Mrs. Dunlap opened the door. She had gone gaunt in a way that had nothing to do with hunger and everything to do with the stripping away of certainty, the particular thinness of a person whose fixed ideas about how the world operates have been disproven by the world itself. The kitchen behind her was bare to the walls, table gone, chairs gone. The children sat on the floor near the stove, which was holding the last warmth of something that had not been firewood for at least a day. Clara carried the wood inside and set it down without ceremony. Mrs. Dunlap stared at it, then at Clara. I told that girl not to come to your place, she said finally. That girl is the reason I knew you needed help, Clara said. You should thank her instead of caging her. She turned and walked back to her sled without waiting for an answer. Behind her, she heard one of the children say something to Mrs. Dunlap in a small voice, but she did not catch the words and she did not look back. Some conversations are complete without a response. Maggie appeared at the cabin door the following morning. She had walked 3 miles through snow that came to her knees alone in boots, 2 sizes too large for her feet, wearing the coat on her back, and carrying in her pocket the piece of bark she had sent with the neighbor child 8 days before. She did not knock. She stood in the open doorway and said, I am staying. She was 14 years old, and she said it the way Clara had said, I am going to the cabin in the probate room at 17. Not with hope, with something that had been compressed by pressure into a form harder and more permanent than hope. Clara looked at her for a moment. Then she picked up a lamp from the shelf and held it out. Bay 3 needs restacking, she said. The splits have shifted. Start there. Maggie took the lamp and went down the ladder without another word. Clara stood at the top of the hatch and listened to her footsteps moving through the tunnel below, steady and unhesitating, a sound she had only ever heard made by her own feet in that passage, and she understood that she was no longer alone in the way that had mattered most. Edgar Poole came on the 8th day. He walked up the hollow with his hat held in both hands in front of him, a posture so unlike his usual stance behind the counter that Clara almost did not recognize the shape of him at first. He stood in her kitchen with his eyes on the floor and said words she could tell had cost him more than any transaction he had ever conducted in 30 years of commerce. "I said things about your husband, Mrs. Holt. About you. I was wrong. I called it foolishness. It was foresight." Clara pointed to the cellar hatch. "Third bay on the left. Take what your family needs." He nodded once and went down without another word. When he came back up with his arms full of oak, he stopped at the door and looked at her and opened his mouth as if there were something more that needed saying. Then he closed it and left. Some silences carry more weight than any sentence that could fill them, and that one was among the heaviest she had witnessed. That evening after dark, a woman arrived alone. Grace Kraft came wrapped in a heavy cloak and with a canvas sack over one shoulder that she set on Clara's table without explanation. Inside was flour-dry beans, a pouch of salt, and 4 tallow candles. She stood with her hands at her sides, her posture precise and deliberate. The posture of a woman who has made a decision and arrived at its destination and is not going to apologize for either. "He will not share what we have," she said. Her voice was steady, her hands were not. "So I am sharing it for him." Clara looked at her and understood what this cost. Not just the sack of provisions, the structure of a life, the arrangement of loyalties and silences that keep a household like the Crafts functional. Grace was choosing her neighbors over her husband's authority, not permanently and not dramatically, but in this moment, in this decision, she had walked through thigh-deep snow to deliver, and that was its own kind of permanence. Clara accepted the food. They did not embrace. They did not make promises. But something passed between them in that kitchen, a recognition that certain kinds of courage require no witness and are not diminished by the absence of one. 3 days later, Vernon Kraft found out. He came to the cabin in the kind of fury that belongs specifically to men who have built their identity around being the person other people fear, and who have just discovered that their wife acted without their permission in the direction of basic human decency. He accused Clara of turning Grace against him, of using the storm to settle grievances, of manipulating a situation she had engineered by withholding information she should have shared. Clara let him finish. He had a great deal to say, and she gave him the space to say all of it. Then she said, "Your wife made her own choice. She chose her neighbors. That is not something I taught her. That is something you failed to." He left without responding. The sound of the door was not a slam. It was something more controlled and therefore more telling, the sound of a man recalibrating rather than retreating. He came back on the 15th day. On foot this time, because the roads were still impossible for horses, and the 3 hours of walking through thigh-deep snow had done something to the architecture of his posture that horseback had always concealed. The rigidity was gone, not broken but redistributed the way ice redistributes when the temperature finally shifts. He stood at the gate with frost in his beard and his hands pressed under his arms and said, "I have come for wood. I can pay whatever price you name." Clara looked at him. She felt the full weight of everything between them, the debt used as a weapon, the threat of foreclosure, the information purchased from Jack Doyle and recited from the saddle like a deed. She had earned the right to name a price that would ruin him. She had earned the right to make him stand in her kitchen and understand in his body what it felt like to be the person with nothing and no options, which was where he had tried to put her from the moment Thomas died. She opened the cellar hatch. "Bay 12, she said. "Take what you need." He stared at the open hatch. She could see him searching for the hidden mechanism, the condition buried in the generosity, the cost that would be revealed later when she had maximum leverage. He was a man who understood the world as a system of transactions, and he could not locate the transaction in what she was offering him. "Your dead men saw farther than I did," he said finally. It was not an apology. She did not need it to be. Carrying the expectation of more would have been a weight she chose not to add to the one she already carried. The cold lasted 49 days. 7 weeks during which temperatures killed livestock in their stalls and froze wells to the bottom of their casings. 7 weeks during which Clara served 9 households from the Holt vault. By the end, her reserve stood at 11 cords. If another hard snap came, she would be in trouble herself. But no one had frozen to death in the valley. Not in any house that had drawn from what Elias Holt built and Thomas Holt maintained, and Clara Holt had found by candlelight on a cold night with numb fingers and a pencil stub and a stubbornness that 4 placement families in 1 probate room full of laughter had not been able to educate out of her. The wood had held. The system had worked. Mrs. Harriet Gale came in March when the roads had cleared enough for a borrowed sleigh. She rode up the hollow, sitting straight as a fence post, with a wool blanket across her knees and the same iron spectacles and the same steel gray bun and an expression Clara had never seen on her face before. It was the expression of a woman carrying something she had been carrying for a long time and had finally identified the right place to set it down. Clara opened the door before she could knock. She gave her tea, let her warm her hands at the stove, sat across from her and waited. The tea cooled in the cup. The fire ticked and settled, and outside the last of the winter's snow was pulling back from the south-facing slopes, retreating in the slow, grudging way of things that held too long and knew it. "I was wrong about your husband," Mrs. Gale said finally. The words came out stiffly, as if each one had to be separated from the next by an act of will. "Wrong about Elias Holt. Wrong about you. The whole valley survived on Holtwood. Children are alive because of what those men built." She set down her teacup. Her hands were trembling, and this time it was not the cold. Clara looked at her and said, "You ran the church dormitory. Back when I was placed there?" "I did. Did you ever receive a letter from Elias Holt?" The color left Mrs. Gale's face. "Not gradually. All at once, the way a candle goes out when the wick is gone, everything present, and then simply not." For a long moment, she did not speak. The only sound in the cabin was the fire working through a split of oak from Bay 4. "How did you know about that?" she said. Her voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper. "I found his notebooks," Clara said. "He wrote about a letter he sent to the county. He was looking for a girl who was good with figures, who was not afraid of work, who might learn what he had built and carry it forward into the next generation." Mrs. Gale's hands tightened on the arms of the chair. She was gripping them the way a person grips something fixed when the ground beneath them becomes uncertain. "I received a letter," she said, "from Elias. He described what he needed, a girl who could keep accounts, who was not afraid of dirt or cold or hard work, who could learn a method and be trusted to continue it." She stopped, drew a breath that was not steady. "I thought him touched in the head, an old man digging holes in the mountain and talking about storing firewood underground like a squirrel. I read the letter twice and I laughed at it, and then I put it in the stove." The room was very quiet. "If I had sent you to him," she said, her voice now carrying something that was not quite controlled, "you would have had years of learning before you needed to use any of it. You would not have nearly starved that first winter. You would not have had to decode his notebooks alone in a cold cabin. You would not have had to figure out the vent shafts by yourself or teach yourself stonework from a man who was already dying." She looked at her hands. "All of it, everything you had to survive alone. It need not have happened that way." Clara sat with that for a moment. She thought about the night on the cabin floor when she had considered quitting. She thought about her hands splitting open on the shovel handle at 18 feet down. She thought about the morning she woke up and could see her own ribs through the gap in her coat and counted them the way she counted faces in a probate room to keep herself steady, to keep the size of the disaster measurable. She thought about all of it, and she let herself think about it without flinching or diminishing it because it deserved to be looked at directly. Then she said, "I forgive you." Mrs. Gale looked at her the way a person looks at a word spoken in a language they studied once and thought they understood, and now realize they never did. "Not because the letter can be unburned," Clara said. "Not because those years can be given back. I forgive you because I will not spend the rest of my life carrying your ash." Mrs. Gale wept. She sat in the cabin with her iron spectacles fogging from the heat of her own tears, and she wept without elegance and without restraint in the way of a person who has not allowed themselves this in so long that the body has forgotten how to do it quietly. Clara did not move to comfort her. She did not offer soft words or a hand on the shoulder. She let the grief run its course because it was Mrs. Gale's grief and it had been a long time coming and it needed room. Before she left, Mrs. Gale composed herself enough to say that Professor Alderman had written to the state agricultural office. A notice had gone out recommending earth-sheltered fuel storage for mountain homesteads across 3 counties. Elias Holt's name was in the notice. Thomas Holt's name was in the notice. The method was being called the Holt method in official correspondence. Clara heard this and felt something she did not try to name. The 2 men who had been called fools by this valley for 2 generations were being called visionaries now by people in offices in towns they had never visited. It did not return them. Nothing could return them. But it was something, and something, as she had learned in the first winter, is what stands between giving up and holding on. After Mrs. Gale left, Clara went down to the tunnel. She walked the full length in the lamplight, past the depleted bays and the empty racks, and the charcoal marks on the stone walls she could now read as fluently as any printed page. She put her hand on the far wall, the wall she and Samuel had built together during that first summer, and she stood there in the cool, still air with her palm flat against the stone. Then she picked up a split of oak and carried it upstairs and fed the fire. There was restocking to plan. There was always the next thing. Samuel Briggs died 6 years later on a spring afternoon when the dogwood was blooming white along the creek run. Clara found him in the chair on the porch, his hands folded in his lap, his gloves placed neatly on the armrest, paired and aligned, as if set down by someone who expected to need them again shortly. A bowl of mushroom soup sat on the side table, still warm. His face was settled into the particular piece of a person who has completed what they came to do and found the completion satisfactory. She sat with him for a long time before going inside to tell anyone. Dogwood petals came down around them both slow and weightless, and the ridge above the cabin held the particular green of a Virginia mountain in early May, and the air carried the smell of turned earth and creek water and the sweetness of things newly growing. The limestone from Cinder Ridge was in his lap. She picked it up. It was warm from his hand. They buried him above the south retaining wall where the drainage run they had built together was visible below. She planted winterberry holly on the grave so there would be something red in the snow when winter came, which it always did and which she was always ready for. His note left in an envelope on top of his tool bag said, "You do not need teaching anymore. Just keep building." He left her his stone tools, his measuring line, the use of his lower meadow as a seasoning yard, and the limestone from Cinder Ridge. She carried it in her coat pocket for the rest of her life. Maggie took over the expansion of the second vault 2 years later. She worked with an assurance that made Clara understand what Samuel must have felt watching her learn the particular satisfaction of seeing a capacity you recognized and cultivated arrive at its full expression. Maggie was the first apprentice. She was not the last. Young men and women came from hollows Clara had never walked to learn the method, and they carried it out into valleys and counties she would never visit, and it took root in each place the way a good idea takes root quietly and without ceremony, and with results that outlast the planting. Jack Doyle came back on a fall afternoon 7 years after the Great Winter. He was older and thinner in the face, and he stood at the gate the way Maggie had once stood there waiting to be invited rather than assuming he was welcome. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not offer explanation. He asked if he could learn the method properly, the right way, he said. Clara looked at him for a long time. Then she picked up a shovel that was leaning against the fence post and held it out to him. "The drainage swale needs clearing," she said. "Start there." It was not forgiveness. It was a door left open. In the mountains where winter closes everything, it can reach an open door is no small thing. She married Robert Dale in 1904. He was a blacksmith who came to repair the well pump and stayed. He said later he stayed because she was the first woman he had met who listened more than she talked. That was not entirely accurate, but she understood what he meant by it. They had 3 children who grew up knowing the tunnel the way other children know their backyards, and who learned to read the charcoal bay markings on the stone walls before they could read a printed page. The Holt method spread to 23 homesteads, and from there to counties Clara never visited, carried by apprentices and agricultural circulars, and the plain, stubborn persistence of an idea that was true and therefore refused to stop. They taught it in the land-grant colleges. They wrote it into extension office recommendations across the state. On the wall above the cellar stairs, in a frame, Darkened by decades of hands brushing past, it hung the inside cover of Thomas's first ledger, the words still legible in his careful blue-black hand. Winter only steals what you leave where winter can reach it. She taught until she could not teach anymore. She wrote down everything Elias had discovered and Thomas had built and Samuel had shown her, and she had learned on her own in that first terrible winter, when the only voices guiding her belonged to dead men and the only warmth she had came from wood she had pulled out of the earth with bleeding hands. The notebooks filled a shelf by the time she was done. Her hands in the end knew every latch and vent pull and bay marker in that tunnel the way a pianist knows the keys of an instrument played for 50 years. She did not need lamplight. She did not need to count her steps. She could walk the passage in total darkness and know exactly where she was by the feel of the stone beneath her fingers, in the particular temperature of the air in each section, in the faint but constant movement of breath through the shafts that Elias had sunk and she had cleared, and that had been drawing steadily, faithfully, for longer than anyone could now remember. They found her on a Tuesday morning in early April, kneeling beside the open hatch with her hand still on the iron ring and the limestone from Cinder Ridge in her coat pocket, and a pencil stub on the floor where it had rolled from her fingers when she was done with it. Her daughter said she looked like a woman who had just remembered something important and was about to go upstairs and tell someone at supper. The tunnel is still there. The stone walls hold. The air still moves through the shafts on quiet days, a breath so faint you have to hold your own breath completely still to feel it against your palm. The Holt method is in the extension records and the land-grant syllabuses and the memory of every family that drew wood from that vault in the winter of 1899 and survived because of it. They remember Elias Holt, who built the first passage. They remember Thomas Holt, who mapped it and measured it and made it precise. They do not always remember to say the third name, the name of the girl who was returned by 4 families for thinking too much, who found an iron ring in a cold, dark cellar on the second night she ever spent on a Virginia mountain ridge, who pulled it open without knowing what she would find, and who spent the rest of her life making sure that what those 2 men built in the earth did not stay buried there. But the vault remembers. The stone remembers. And on still days in early spring, when the air moves through the shafts the way it has always moved, patient and constant and indifferent to who is listening, you can feel it if you stand at the entrance and hold very still. It feels like breathing. It feels like something that has never once stopped.